shake my nerves and you rattle my brain. Too much love drives a man insane. You broke my will, but what a thrill. Goodness gracious, great balls of fire. I let you love what I thought it was funny. You came along and...
Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy decade. From Elvis to Eisenhower, baby boomers to blooming suburbia, the 1950s brought lots of change. The population exploded as veterans returned for more, and America's middle class reached new numbers. Rock and roll glamorized teenage rebellion, and Hollywood stars like Marilyn Monroe burst onto the black and white screen. The introduction of pop culture turned the U.S. into the face of conformity, with strict social rules put into place and categories separated by gender, race, and class. America was considered the summit of the world, but behind those white picket fences and red carpet glitz, poverty, racial tension, and paranoia loomed. Let's reflect on the 50s, in a quiet suburban neighborhood about to be turned upside down. Who are these figures cruising down the block?
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The stars of the 1950s were rebels. In an age of conformity, some of the most iconic figures were suggestive. Among these rebels stood pop culture icons Marilyn Monroe, James Dean, and the king of rock, Elvis Presley. According to the New York Sun, rock and roll, a term in the African American community which meant having sex, was the intersection of black and white musical traditions. Elvis was not the creator of rock and roll, but he definitely played his part. Elvis found inspiration in African American gospel music and in jazz. Marilyn Monroe escaped her life of foster homes and orphanages to strike it big in Hollywood. Marilyn Monroe embodied the perfect woman of the 1950s, an hourglass figure and blonde hair. Marilyn Monroe's status as a sex symbol continues on to this day. Famous rebel without a cause, James Dean became the embodiment of the youth of the 1950s. James Dean was only in a handful of movies, most notably Rebel Without a Cause and East of Eden. In the movies he often played a sensitive outcast who was just trying to find his way through life, which struck a chord with many audiences, making him a role model for many teens. His popularity lasts till present day despite his tragic death in 1955. These three figures show that there were many in the 1950s who were not ready to conform to the ideal family of the 1950s.
The baby boomers increased the population significantly in the late 50s and into the 60s, encouraging the nuclear family stereotype, which was conformed to more and more. This nuclear family, consisting of a heterosexual couple and their children, was considered something to strive for, a stark contrast to the teenage angst theme present in the 50s media. Along with the baby boomers and the growing families, the development of suburbs also boomed. Suburbs started to pop up on the outskirts of many cities and towns at an extraordinary rate. These suburbs created the perfect housing and community to raise a family. This was the origin of houses with symbolic or literal white picket fences, providing a picture-perfect backdrop for conformist families. A significant amount of people were moving away from dirty, crowded cities and fleeing to suburbs to raise their families, but redlining and a lack of socioeconomic opportunity for people of color prevented African Americans and other minorities from partaking in these moves.
The 1950s are thought of as a time of great prosperity, and even Time magazine predicted the elimination of poverty as a fact of human life. While it is true that the economy was booming, there was another part of the United States that wasn't prospering. There was plenty of poverty in the 1950s. Life, particularly in inner cities, was difficult because of the mass relocation to the suburbs. The government's solution to this problem was the Housing Act of 1949 that, despite its goal to house every American, made it harder for the poor people in the city. The act funded public housing and urban renewal, which destroyed many slums and replaced them with nicer housing. There was an intention for lower-income housing, but there wasn't enough to cover these displaced by the demolition of the previous housing. This effectively worsened poverty. These problems were invisible to most of the United States, and many of the well-off Americans were able to ignore the problem. It wasn't until 1962 that poor people became more visible and the United States government could provide more help to those who needed it. Our mural aims to highlight this divide. mural is broken up into three parts. The rebellious middle, which is symbolized by Marilyn Monroe, James Dean, and Elvis Presley. The right, which symbolizes the affluent, and the left, which symbolizes the poor. The right has bright and saturated colors, which symbolizes the advertisement age and the ideals of the affluent. The dark, gloomy colors on the left represent the dismal conditions of poverty. The mural focuses mainly on the divide between the poor and the rich.